Hi, my name is Jason Debney and I am the coordinator of the Thames Landscape Strategy. The following presentation provides a brief introduction to an exciting new project of ours called Rewilding Arcadia. Before we start though, I will explain a little bit about the Thames Landscape Strategy and what we mean by the Arcadian Thames. Between Weybridge, Hampton and Kew, the River Thames meanders through a unique landscape of world-famous parks, royal palaces and working communities that has been known for 300 years as the Arcadian Thames. Centuries of settlement, aristocratic patronage and local action has left a remarkable legacy of architecture, accessible open space and wildlife, considered to be one of the most culturally significant urban landscapes in the world, offering unrivaled recreational benefits. Arcadia means rural paradise. This Arcadia is a countryside in the city, a multi-layered landscape where people, water, history and wildlife coexist. In the 1990s, the pressure for inappropriate development along the river between Hampton, Weybridge and Kew, and a growing realisation that something had to be done to protect its heritage, wildlife and traditions, galvanised local people into action. The Arcadian Thames was in need of help. The Thames Landscape Strategy was born, and in 1994 the 100-year vision at the core of the organisation was published. For 25 years, the Thames Landscape Strategy has been the guardians of this unique landscape, working through its partnership of 380 local groups, more than 1,000 individuals and riparian authorities to conserve, promote and enhance the wildlife, heritage features and recreational opportunities on and beside the river. The Thames Landscape Strategy has been the catalyst for a real renaissance in the fortunes of the Arcadian Thames. The 1994 cross-river vision has steered change, influenced policy and planning decisions, with many TLS aspirations now firmly embedded in partner core strategies. The organisation has raised £21 million for restoration, environmental management and educational projects, and has been the inspiration for a further £25 million raised by other groups. People have always been at the core of the organisation, connecting people with and increasing their understanding of the river landscape. The Thames Landscape Strategy has managed 385,000 hours of volunteer conservation work and completed over 200 education and outreach projects. A wealth of local knowledge has been amassed, and it is now hard to imagine what the Arcadian Thames would be like without our work. Rewilding Arcadia is the next stage in rolling out the Thames Landscape Strategy. The Arcadian Thames is characterised by high-quality publicly owned open space, a multi-layered landscape of parks, gardens, historic houses and wildlife sites. Many of these open spaces are located within the statutory floodplain, both on the tidal and freshwater river. By their very nature, they should be places that are resilient to flooding. However, previous land use decisions have seen much of the wildness of the Arcadian floodplain lost through modifications to the river channel. As a result, the floodplain's capacity to function during a flood has been greatly reduced, to the detriment of wildlife and recreational use. At the same time, public perception towards the purpose of floodplain has shifted, as spaces that were historically regarded as wet are now managed as dry environments. Unexpected but quite normal flooding causes great surprise. Urban populations are no longer connected with wildlife and the natural world. The intrinsic relationship between the dynamism and function of the river floodplain with the communities that live alongside it has almost disappeared, as floodable places have been tamed. To a large extent, the loss of the natural floodplain has not been a problem. The climate emergency, however, has altered the balance. The river is reclaiming its lost floodplain back. This process is now starting to harm wildlife and is altering established recreational use. Launched by Sir David Attenborough, Rewilding Arcadia proposes a new way to restore the lost Arcadian floodplain in order to explain the complex processes that underpin natural floodplain management and to prepare floodable places for increasing inundation as climate uncertainty accelerates throughout the coming century. The TLS is currently working with communities, planners, policymakers and practitioners to champion ways to adapt the open spaces along the river so that they can become more resilient to climate change and increase in flood risk, while still retaining their character. In 2019, the TLS successfully completed the trial phase in the project, a £500,000 floodplain restoration scheme in partnership with Historic Royal Palaces at the Home Park Water Meadows, Hampton Court. The next phase to Rewild Arcadia proposes to see natural flood risk management solutions rolled out to 6 further locations on the Arcadian Thames. These are at Ham and Petersham, the Old Deer Park in Richmond to Brentford, Canbury Gardens at Kingston, Desborough Island and Hurst Park in East Molesey. Rewilding Arcadia, however, is so much more than this. Alongside this action on the ground, the project also proposes a comprehensive learning and outreach programme to increase public understanding about natural floodplain management. Rewilding Arcadia will always put nature first, setting out practical measures to implement strategic government and local policies on the ground. In this way, Rewilding Arcadia can increase community and business resilience to flooding and enhance the natural capital and associated ecosystem services that the floodplain provides. Through natural floodplain management, Rewilding can prepare the floodplain and people for flooding that, when offered alongside more engineered flood defence solutions, can slow, store and filter floodwater. This should be seen within the context of a broader agenda to see multiple benefits in floodplain naturalisation, including enhanced recreational opportunities, habitat creation and the restoration of historic landscapes. Rewilding Arcadia is all about the floodplain. So what is a floodplain? Well, river systems are much wider than the watery channels we associate with them. The areas next to rivers, which are only covered by water during floods, are also part of the river system and known as floodplains. In their natural condition, floodplains are an important ecological part of this system. They filter and store water. They naturally clean pollution. They secure natural flood protection, making the river landscape more resilient to flooding. They ensure the healthy functioning of the river, and they sustain a high biological diversity. They are also an important economic resource, providing a place for people to enjoy multiple recreational benefits. And finally, they mitigate the effects of climate change through carbon capture. Over the centuries, much of the Arcadian Thames, though, has been modified to aid navigation, promote modern agricultural practices, to provide a place to build on and to protect communities from flooding. As the river has been canalised, much of the dynamism and ecological diversity of the natural floodplain has been lost. There is no longer an intrinsic connection between the river and its floodplain along much of the Thames in London. The loss of the world floodplain is part of a much wider global trend to tame nature. Today, most Londoners have lost touch with nature and few understand what the floodplain is for. Rewilding Arcadia sets out to restore some of the lost functions of a natural floodplain in order to reconnect people with their river and its wildlife. In doing so, it will be possible to promote an understanding of the multiple functions of the floodplain through a series of environmental measures and educational projects. At its heart, Rewilding Arcadia is about helping the river to reclaim its floodplain back in a managed and sustainable way, restoring the natural processes and habitats that once governed life along the Thames. In this way, a whole series of additional recreational, economic and health benefits can be achieved. Throughout much of London, measures to reconnect people with their lost natural floodplain, however, are limited due to the high flood defences that run along the riverbank. Upstream of Chiswick and below Windsor, however, the river is managed in a different way. There is a lot of undefended, public accessible open space, most of which is in the care of forward-thinking authorities who are open to exciting new ways to manage the fragile floodplain. Even here, though, the river is still highly controlled and modified, with a low level of appreciation from the community regarding what the floodplain is for. This map shows the floodplain. Only the black hatched area is defended. The different shades of blue represent the functioning floodplain. These places are at risk from a flood, as you can see. In many places, the flood defence is a considerable way from the river channel. A good proportion of the at-risk areas, however, are formed by open space, towpaths and gardens. This makes them ideal candidates for rewilding. The Arcadian Thames is at risk from both a fluvial flood moving downstream, a tidal surge coming from the sea, and a combination of both. The Thames barrier is currently used to protect London from a tidal surge and to protect the Arcadian Thames from a fluvial flood meeting a high tide. The Thames barrier, though, cannot be used for both at the same time. Time is running out. It is also time to stop talking and make the changes that we know are coming. In order to prepare the floodplain for the climate emergency, we need to make space for water to provide sustainable multi-use floodplains for people, wildlife and occasionally for floodwater. Along the tideway, riverside communities already live with water, such as here at Richmond Riverside. However, as climate change continues to change, the flood risk will increase with time. What is wet now is likely to get a lot wetter. In the future, we're going to have to live with water a lot more. This type of event may become the new normal in 25 years' time. When considered alongside more usual methods of flood control, such as barriers, flood walls and water diversion channels, Making Space for Water proposes a series of measures to manage the risk and the consequences of any given flood event in a sustainable way, including the controlled inundation of riverside areas, living with water and emergency planning. A key element in the Making Space for Water agenda is to restore floodplains back to a more natural state, particularly in places where wetlands and habitats such as natural riverbanks have been lost. A range of solutions have already been looked at by many authorities for the Arcadian Thames, including the construction of new flood defence walls. Here, the image shows the height that a flood wall would need to be in Petersham to protect the floodplain from flooding. I hope everyone would agree that this method is totally unsuitable and would destroy much of the character of the riverside. In 2002 and again in 2018, the Environment Agency considered the lowering of land to create extra flood storage capacity at Ham. This option has also been rejected for now, following a cost-benefit analysis. Finally, there is little scope for new floodplain creation or flood relief channels along the Arcadian Thames. Where this has been looked at, it simply doesn't stack up. We need new floodplain the size of Oxfordshire to make a difference. So what happens upstream and in the outer estuary is important to us along the Arcadian Thames. This approach has been informed by strategic flood risk models for the Thames. The Environment Agency has identified that the Arcadian Thames is at considerable risk from flooding, and that this risk will continue to increase with time as climate change accelerates. We can expect that a greater part of the floodplain will be inundated with water in the future, and that this flooding will happen with increasing frequency. The traditional approach to protect London and its suburbs from the Thames has been to construct higher and higher flood defences, usually in response to a flood event. As climate change accelerates, sea level rises and storm intensity increases, however, the Environment Agency has said that this option is no longer sustainable. Instead, a series of measures to manage flood risk on the River Thames that embraces the Making Space for Water approach have been adopted. For the purposes of Rewilding Arcadia, these include the River Thames scheme, Datchet to Teddington, and the Thames Estuary 2100 scheme for the tidal river. The two flood risk management plans look to the next 100 years and are risk consequence based, responding to the changing needs of the river rather than reacting to any given flood event in the past. The strategy has accounted for what is at risk, how many places are protected at present, and possible future flooding scenarios. From these studies, the consequences of the risk from flooding can be identified, with detailed flood risk models produced for a series of different flooding scenarios. Many of the potential factors that could affect flooding in the future, such as sea level rise and an increase in fluvial floods, are uncertain, however. For this reason, a number of future management options have been identified. In this way, the flood risk plans are flexible, a portfolio of measures that can be adapted over time depending on how climate changes. In this way, the risk from flooding can be kept below an acceptable level through the intervention of a series of different measures that respond to climate change rather than reacting against it. These include floodplain restoration to create places that are resilient to increasing flood risk. The Environment Agency has also identified that under the government's current climate change scenario, which is a sea level rise of 0.94 metres, the risk from rising water levels can be managed. This could change, however, if, for example, sea level rises more quickly than is currently anticipated. At the moment, it is not expected that any major upgrade to the current system of defences or a major new engineering project will be needed before 2030 in the tidal Thames, as the Thames barrier, with some adaptation, will continue to provide protection, and existing flood defences have a greater safety margin than previously was thought. The model stresses, however, that flood risk will continue to rise over this period, and that places that are wet at the moment are likely to get wetter, so they will need to adapt. In the freshwater reaches, the Environment Agency is developing a major new flood risk management scheme called the River Thames Scheme Datchet to Teddington. The River Thames Scheme will meet the recommendations set out in the Lower Thames Flood Risk Management Strategy to reduce the consequences of a flood event consisting of 3 new flood channels, improvements to the existing Thames weirs, installation of property-level products to make them more resilient to flooding, and improved flood incident response plans. At a local level, floodplain resilience will be required, particularly as it has been identified that peak fluvial flow at Teddington could increase by up to 40%. That is where Rewilding Arcadia comes in. Rewilding is the creation of a living landscape, a way of managing land so that the needs of wildlife are put first, and nature can take care of itself. In this way, species can adapt and survive naturally as climate changes. The River Thames being a large enough wildlife corridor for species to naturally move through. To sustain a diverse variety of species, however, there has to be a framework of these connected habitats so that the wildlife can move from one place to another, significantly reducing the potential for extinction and being able to find refuge in times of drought or flood. Rewilding seeks to reinstate natural processes and, where appropriate, missing species, allowing them to shape the landscapes and the habitats within. Rewilding in its purest form, however, may prove difficult to achieve in an urban environment that is heavily modified, attracts a large number of visitors, and contains multiple layers of heritage assets that are cherished by local people. We will follow the 4 key rewilding principles though as far as possible in order to bring nature back to life and restore living systems along the Thames that always put nature first. Rewilding the Arcadian floodplain offers an opportunity to increase public understanding about the natural world and to reconnect communities with nature. Whilst it is true that the river instinctively acts as a mechanism that fosters a sense of being part of a much greater natural process than would normally be the norm, the perceived high quality and safe environment that the modified floodplain offers, together with the relative protection from flooding that is provided by the defence network, means that many people would question whether the river landscape was anything but completely natural or wild. There are 3 strategic aims to Rewilding Arcadia. These are reconnecting people with the natural Arcadian Thames floodplain, using the landscape, and restoration of the lost floodplain. Let's take each one of these aims in turn. The first aim sets out to reconnect people with the natural Arcadian Thames floodplain. In this way, we can rediscover, value and increase understanding about the connection between people with their floodplain, using the principles of rewilding, integrated catchment management, planning and climate change as a guide. This will use the role that water has in shaping the identity of communities at a local, regional and global level to demonstrate how communities, planners, policymakers and practitioners can adapt to and become more resilient to climate change and flood risk. It will encourage a range of communities and those disconnected with the Thames to have a greater understanding of the unique history and function of the Thames floodplain through a series of education, lifelong learning and outreach initiatives linked to the making space for water, flood risk, catchment management and Rewilding Arcadia processes. To achieve this, 5 themes have been identified to form the basis of the Rewilding Arcadia education programme. The first goal is the Thames through time. This will explore how the Thames is a constantly changing dynamic river. It will identify what is the natural floodplain, how the Thames has been tamed and why. In essence, it is telling the story of the Arcadian Thames. The second goal looks at how we have protected ourselves from and the consequences of historic Thames floods and the need for change in our approach to flood risk management through the use of blue-green infrastructure, for example, and the role of the Thames Barrier. Wildlife along the Thames floodplain will be explored, whilst complex processes such as catchment management planning will be explained to communities in a simple and understandable way. How the Thames floodplain has been used is an important consideration. What are the traditional industries and settlement patterns? And what are the recreational, tourist and health opportunities offered by a rewilded floodplain? Of course linked to access and volunteering schemes. Finally, what is the future of the floodplain? How will climate change alter the floodplain? What changes may be needed to adapt and restore the floodplain in the wider context of climate change and increasing flood risk? One interesting element of the project is to place a true economic value on the Arcadian Thames and how this could be affected by climate change. The second aim is all about how people use the landscape. This aim sets out to improve social inclusion by involving people from all areas through consultation, volunteering and events, whilst increasing the recreational, health and economic value of the River Thames. This will be achieved by improving infrastructure such as signage, interpretation, footpaths, cycleways, bridges and viewing places in a way that fosters greater access to the floodplain and its wildlife, both in times of drought and flood, and its significance in terms of heritage, use and conservation. As climate changes, it is expected that more people will want to use open space, putting these places under increasing pressure from visitors. It is important that the riverside remains accessible to all people from every background at all times, at the same time as though the floodplain will be at increasing risk from inundation from rising water levels that could put these recreational commuter use of the floodplain at risk. At the moment, the floodplain is simply not ready for climate change. Take the floodplain at Ham, for example. This image shows the Thames path at low tide, and then again 2 hours later at the peak of the high tide. This inundation halts all forms of access, including use of the towpath for commuting. When the water recedes, the towpath is left wet and muddy with flotsam and jetsam. Volunteering and citizen science will of course form an essential element of the Rewilding Arcadia project. The third aim of Rewilding Arcadia is to restore the lost floodplain. This will enable natural flood management through the rewilding of some of the lost functions of the floodplain at 6 strategic locations to increase community and business resilience and enhance natural capital and associated ecosystem services. It will demonstrate how the river and its floodplain form a functional unit. A dynamism that we have seen has largely been lost. It will also ensure that the connections between these 6 places are enhanced as part of a holistic landscape scale conservation approach. Each of the 6 locations that have been chosen are different, yet all are within an urban or semi-urban location. They sit within the statutory floodplain area and all have lost much of their capacity to function as a naturally functioning floodplain river unit. The goals of Aim 3 are to create spaces that are resilient to climate change and future flood risk and drought, where the river can function in a natural way and wildlife can flourish. Wetland enhancement, including reedbed creation and restoration, wet woodland creation, creation of scrapes and new or improved wet graze meadow, riverbank naturalisation, backwater habitat creation, including deculverting, creation of streams, standing water and sluices, to improve habitat for wildlife, including fish and invertebrates and eels, to manage and where possible to increase flood storage capacity through the management of the release back of water into the main river channel following a flood, to implement measures for carbon capture and storage, improvements to the connectivity between the main channel and the backwater habitats, to deliver measures beyond the 6 strategic sites that will increase the river's capacity to act as a wildlife corridor, to maximise opportunities for community engagement, volunteering and education, to ensure that public access, recreation, economic and tourism benefits are all included at each 6 site, to deliver partner goals and policies on the ground, such as the catchment management plans, or the flood risk strategies, such as T2100 or the River Thames scheme. But above all, it is to create spaces where wildlife and the river can function in as natural way as possible. Each of the 6 strategic sites will form a separate project under the umbrella of Rewilding Arcadia, but the delivery of these may be led by one of our partners or by us. So, let us look at each of the 6 sites in turn. The first of the 6 key strategic sites is Desborough Island. Desborough Island is a 112-acre man-made island formed in the 1930s by the digging of the Desborough Cut by the Thames Conservancy. The island is mainly open space, playing fields and water treatment facilities, with just a few houses. The island has access over 2 bridges from Walton Lane, connecting it to both Weybridge and Walton upon Thames. It is a site of nature conservation importance and is largely managed by Elmbridge Borough Council. Thames Landscapes has carried out much conservation work over the past decade, including hedge planting and laying, scrub management and invasive species control. Along the riverbank, dense sycamore growth has been thinned to encourage native shrub growth. The open spaces are a popular, if somewhat underused, public amenity. Due to the degraded landscape, there is some antisocial activity in the island that is a known barrier to use. The island has the potential for a multi-layered floodplain restoration scheme, set within the wider goals for improving public access, habitat creation and new grassland management regimes. It is also located immediately opposite the outfall of one of the new flood relief channels proposed by the River Thames scheme. The island has been identified as a priority area for habitat enhancement work by both the Catchment Management Plan and the River Thames scheme. The latter proposes habitat works that would naturally accommodate water during times of flood. The artificial riverbanks of the Desborough Cut could be considerably improved through the reprofiling and naturalisation of the Desborough Island riverbank, including the creation of new beaches that could form a focus for family use, helping to reduce the potential for antisocial behaviour. Rewilding could see the management of sycamore and the reintroduction of native plants such as hazel, alder, willow and poplar. The control of Himalayan balsam is a key consideration that could be managed through volunteer action. Where new riverside glades are formed, riparian native planting could be introduced. The meadow near to Desborough Point has the potential for considerable rewilding linked to measures to manage flood risk. A series of natural wetland habitats could be created, such as weed beds, marginal planting, backwaters, scrapes, depressions and wet meadowland. This could be linked to the phased reintroduction of grazed wet meadows, managed as part of the TLS floating herd. The planting of native woodland, reed bed and scrub would increase the island's diversity, whilst helping to act as a carbon sink. It is also proposed that an artificial sand martin bank could be installed on the island. Rewilding Arcadia proposes a multi-benefit scheme to create a public open space that could easily become a top Thames destination in its own right, particularly if the connections with Weybridge, Walton and Shepperton, via the footway of course, are enhanced. Off-site improvements to encourage people to access the island would be required, such as those proposed at Weybridge Point, whilst the landscape into the entrances of the islands, with some limited signage and interpretation, linked to wider improvements to walking routes and volunteering, could have considerable benefits. The estimated total cost of the project is £450,000. It is proposed that the rewilding of Desborough Island should be carried out in partnership with the EA, Elmbridge Borough Council, Surrey County Council and of course the TLS. We wait the findings of the River Thames scheme. The second of the rewilding sites is Hurst Park with Molesey Riverside. Hurst Park was created 50 years ago following the closure of the Hurst Park racecourse. The riverside meadows were laid out as planning game during the construction of the Hurst Park estate. The meadows are rich in sporting and cultural history. The cherished open space is laid to meadow and parkland, with small copses breaking the scene. At its centre is a public car park, interpretation marker and a slipway. Much of the open space is situated within the functioning floodplain, and it regularly floods. The flood risk extends to housing situated to the meadow in the nearby estate. The park is designated as a district park and includes several locally important view lines that crisscross the area linking Hampton with Molesey. It is owned by 3 organisations: the Environment Agency, Elmbridge Borough Council and Surrey County Council. Although being a riverside park situated within the functioning floodplain, there is little connection between the river and the open space. The Hurst Park Management Plan included proposals for the naturalisation of the riverbank and the creation of backwater habitat linked to the main channel. More recently, these measures have been promoted by the Environment Agency in their Catchment Management Plan and the Flood Risk Plan for the Lower Thames. including the introduction of scrapes, areas of standing water, and the creation of gravel beaches to encourage fish spawning. Rewilding Arcadia looks towards riverbank reprofiling and naturalisation, connected to measures to create new areas of wetland further inland. These could be linked to the main channel, with further enhancements of the riverbank towards Albany Reach, and of course the in-channel enhancements. This would include new gravel foreshore, scrapes, areas of standing water and reed bed. The old slipway could be enhanced to create a usable public amenity, whilst creating a large beach with marginal planting. In particular, this scheme would look towards ways that the project could be used as a mechanism to engage with local communities regarding flood risk resilience in nearby properties. In this way, Rewilding Arcadia has the potential to deliver a series of strategic measures on the ground that would complement both the River Thames scheme and the catchment management plan. The Thames Landscape Strategy has a good relationship with the local community and carries out a 3-month annual volunteer programme in partnership with the Surrey Care Trust Swimbridge programme every winter, which manages the landscape and enhances its wildlife benefit. Through rewilding, the potential to transform the way that local communities perceive the river, its floodplain and flood risk can all be explored, restoring both the interconnectivity between the main channel and its floodplain and the responsibility that residents have in living in an at-risk location. The third rewilding area is Home Park Water Meadows at Hampton Court Palace. The first phase in the restoration of the Home Park Water Meadows saw an ambitious £490,000 project to understand, open up and restore this ancient but neglected wetland area that dates back to the founding of the palace itself. Within the wetland system are paddocks, extensive depressions and water collection areas that once formed valuable wetland habitats and collectively form one of the oldest remaining floodplain drainage systems in southern England. The system was managed historically as Grays Wet Meadows for stock grazing. The site is now home to Her Majesty the Queen's Royal Wholesale Stud and the Hampton Court Palace Shire horses. The next stage in the restoration will see further access enhancements to open up the landscape to guided groups, and also to continue to carry out environmental enhancements such as reed bed management and tree planting. It is also proposed to identify ways to link the emerging and significant wetlands within the home park to the main channel of the river, and to encourage the improvements that have taken place to be replicated along the Thames as it flows alongside the park. This could have wider benefits to the area, such as at Albany Reach, the Bard Walk and Green Elizabeth Promenade in Kingston. The project benefits would include riverbank naturalisation, softening of the riverside walls, native planting along the riverbank, reed bed management and creation, tree management and planting, water vole reintroduction, engagement with communities who live in the functioning floodplain but may not necessarily be aware of this, and involvement of the community through volunteering. Importantly, any new reed bed creation acts as a way of filtering pollutants out of the Longford River, which enters the Thames at this site. The rewilding of Canby Gardens. Canby Gardens is a Victorian park located on the banks of the River Thames at Kingston. The gardens are a 5-minute stroll along the Thames from Kingston's ancient marketplace and bustling shopping district. To the north are the Arcadian fields of Ham, to the east is the Victorian suburb of Norbiton, and to the west, on the opposite river bank, is the Thameside village of Hampton. Thames Path and a national cycle route pass through the park. 100 years ago, the newly laid open space was the pride of the town, a magnificent pleasure garden that attracted visitors from across London to promenade and enjoy the river. Today, however, the park suffers from 60 years of gradual decline, the accelerating effects of climate change and a conflict between different users. In response, the Royal Borough of Kingston has worked with the TLS to commission LDA design to develop a master plan for the restoration of the gardens. This exciting project is the first phase in a long-term strategic plan to create a diverse, well-used and accessible public park at the heart of Kingston. The project sets out a series of measures to enhance the open space that will tackle the effects of flood risk and introduce an exciting proposal to accommodate both cyclists and walkers on restored promenade. Significantly, this measure frees the riverbank and the lower section of the gardens for rewilding. It is proposed to create a natural riverbank that will provide a diverse habitat for a variety of species to thrive, whilst being resilient to climate change and increasing flood risk by building resilience into a naturalised bank. The Canby Gardens Master Plan is a multifaceted scheme that will be funded through several different sources. The rewilding of the riverbank itself would be made possible once the measures to provide cycling and walking routes have been put in place to the raised promenade. It can function as a standalone project, set within the context of the wider restoration objectives of the gardens. The project benefit would include riverbank naturalisation and reprofiling, using stone gabions to deflect water and floodwater, beach creation, building natural resilience and providing a place for people to access the river, introduction of gravel beds to retrieve riffles, flow regulation, refuge and spawning grounds, softening of the riverside walls linked to the enhancements of 2 new riverside entrances, native planting along the riverbank, engagement with communities that live on the functioning floodplain, and involvement of the community through volunteering. The estimated total cost of the project is £240,000. Ham and Petersham, where Thames' first rural grows. Nestled below the protected view from Richmond Hill, Ham and Petersham is one of the most protected landscapes in the UK. In the 18th century, it provided the inspiration for the creation of the English landscape movement. The area is at considerable risk from flooding, being at the junction of the tidal and fluvial rivers, with the statutory flood defences located a significant distance from the river itself. As such, large areas of public parkland, historic gardens, wildlife sites and footpaths are located within the functioning floodplain. These open spaces are at increasing risk of inundation, particularly on the spring tides when a fluvial flood coincides with a high tide. Public access along the Thames path is being compromised and established wildlife sites are being damaged. The area, though, offers considerable potential for rewilding in order to make the Sylvian fields once again more resilient to flood risk. TLS Aspirations propose a series of measures to manage the floodplain, with the creation of new backwater habitats linked to the main river channel. The scheme details ways to link the aspirations of the London Borough of Richmond to enhance walking and cycling through the creation of a series of discrete dry routes that would be connected to the wider landscape through goals such as the landscaping of Petersham Meadows River Wall and the Great River Avenue. On Petersham Meadows itself, it is proposed to work in partnership with the National Trust to create additional scrapes and depressions to control the flow of floodwater and increase wetland diversity. The Petersham Trust is proposing the landscaping of the concrete bund that could be linked to a footpath enhancements to create dry routes. In Petersham Lodge Woods and the Sea Scout grounds is an area of emerging wet woodland. Following survey work, Rewilding Arcadia proposes connecting the wet woodland with adjacent habitats through the creation of a series of backwater channels and creeks. The towpath that runs alongside the wetland is often unusable due to tidal floodwater. The installation of a discrete boardwalk that runs from River Lane to Douglas Meadow footpath through Petersham Lodge Wood and the boundary of the Sea Scout land could form a much needed dry route. This would only be needed at the top of the tide. The rest of the time, the boardwalk could form a viewing area to the endangered habitat and be linked to measures to create a strong barrier to the Sea Scout land and to those measures carried out in Petersham Meadows, therefore connecting Richmond with Ham, even in times of flood. Along the Petersham towpath, survey work is needed to inform the way that the water is carried in and out of the existing backwaters across the towpath. Once the hydrology of the area is established, there is the potential to connect the backwaters with the main river channel through the creation of a new channel underneath the Thames path. Sluices could be used to control water levels, whilst a discrete bridge would take the footpath over the new channel. This dry route could be continued through Queen Elizabeth's Meadow in the form of an earthen grassed bund, linked to the Douglas Meadow Boardwalk and the Hamilton's Boardwalk. Elsewhere in the meadow, enhancements to the wetland habitat could form a possible new area of standing water linked to the tidally fed backwater channel. At Hunter's Pond, the Hamilton Sluice could be used to link the wider movement of water and the backwaters to each other. On the Ham towpath, tree works and scrub management could open areas that are currently dominated by Himalayan balsam and suckling elm to encourage a diverse understory of native plants. Upstream of Ham Street Car Park, the towpath is breached in 5 locations by the high tides. This allows the water to enter the Hamlands backwaters, but it erodes the towpath. At these locations, measures to control the way that the water makes its way from the river to the backwaters could be controlled to facilitate the emerging backwater habitat. It would also have the advantage of allowing users to use the Thames path even in times of flood. The Great River Avenue Woodland Wide could be managed in a traditional way using heavy horses and volunteers. A narrow vista to the river and Star and Garter home could be maintained. On King George's playing field, a new avenue of native lime trees could be planted to complete the missing link in the Great River Avenue between the Woodland Wide and Ham Street. Finally, the various islands could be considerably rewilded, particularly to form habitat for birds and invertebrates. There is no other stretch of the river likely to be affected by climate change more than that at Ham. If the character and resilience of the river is to be maintained, it is important that any works that take place in the floodplain follow a shared master plan. The TLS is proposing that this project will be brought forward in partnership with Richmond Council, the local community, the National Trust, the Environment Agency's TE2100 scheme and the Ham Neighbourhood Forum to ensure that limited financial resources can be used to match fund a larger funding bid, and that well-meaning works carried out in the short term do not need to be replaced in the near future once a detailed scheme is agreed by all the partners. It is proposed to work towards a major funding bid for this stretch of the river in 2020 for rewilding is between Richmond and Brentford. The project is set out in a document called An Agreeable Wilderness, which the TLS first published back in the summer of 2019. The Arcadian Thames between Richmond and Kew is formed by a series of private and public open spaces that are the remnants of a succession of former royal palaces and gardens dating from the medieval times. These include Kew Gardens, Syon House, the Old Deer Park, the site of Sheen Palace, the King's Observatory and the site of Richmond Lodge. Immediately downstream of Richmond Town Centre, the Old Deer Park is a large public open space, given over to playing fields, golf course and other sporting facilities. Rewilding Arcadia is concerned with the lower sections of the Old Deer Park, that comprises of a large area of amenity grassland that is regularly flooded on the spring tides. This restricts public access. Beyond is the Royal Mid-Surrey Golf Course. The Kew Ha-Ha runs between the golf course and the towpath, forming a valuable but degraded habitat of wet and dry woodland. Between Isleworth and Kew Gardens is one of the last surviving wilderness walks along London's river. Long-term aspirations look to link the towpath with the Kew Road, the construction of a footpath that would cross the river to Isleworth to the reinstatement of the Lost Ferry. On the opposite riverbank is Syon Park, with its magnificent water meadows, the last natural stretch of riverbank in the capital. Although situated immediately adjacent to this royal landscape, the ancient town of Brentford developed in the Victorian age as an industrial centre, with a large gas and coke works and the terminus of the Grand Union Canal. Much of this area is now being redeveloped as housing. In the river itself, the various islands form a green oasis, teeming with wildlife, before Kew Gardens is reached. Rewilding Arcadia proposes a two-stage rewilding process of this special landscape. Stage 2 of the project will look to the installation of vertical foreshore to the sheep pylon alongside the River Brent confluence. To the Kew Gardens riverbank opposite, measures to green the sloping concrete revetments could be investigated. Naturalisation of these river edges would help to recover what is known as a break in the green corridor along the river. In the shorter term, however, the TLS has teamed up with the London Borough of Richmond to put together a project to rewild the lower riverside section of the Old Deer Park, the Kew Ha-Ha and the associated wet woodland. The first part in this project is to carry out an ecological and hydrological survey of the area to provide a baseline about what is there. This is funded by Richmond Council and will be carried out over the summer of 2020. The flagship scheme is the creation of a new 5-hectare area of tidally fed wetlands on the riverside grassland in the Old Deer Park. The lower section of the Old Deer Park is laid out mainly to amenity grassland that regularly floods on the monthly spring tides. Inundation can last for up to a week. Flood risk models predict that this inundation is only going to increase over time. Rewilding Arcadia will look to creating a series of different habitats, including areas of standing water in the places that flood the most, reed beds, scrapes, marginal areas and wet meadow. This mosaic of habitats will be designed to gradually merge into the dry amenity grassland on and above the statutory flood defence. This could become a very special place, a true wilderness, yet right on the doorstep of Richmond Town Centre. To provide a suitable gateway to the wetland, Rewilding Arcadia will look to the landscaping of the land between Old Palace Lane, the railway and the 316, including footpath enhancements, planting, wetland creation and modifications to the sluices. This element of the project links with the work currently planned by the London Borough of Richmond and the Friends of the Old Deer Park. Further downstream, the Kew Ha is an important habitat for saprophytic invertebrates. However, it has not been surveyed for over a decade. It is also silting up, restricting water flow, and self-sown sycamore trees and Himalayan balsam are a significant issue along the riverbank. Diversity is being lost. Rewilding Arcadia proposes works to restore the towpath vegetation back to a more native state through the removal of the invasive species and the encouragement of a native understory. Some views will be opened up to the river that will introduce much needed light. Following the survey work to be carried out in the summer, it is proposed to restore the Ha for its wildlife benefit and introduce a management programme that is based on natural regeneration. In the Ha itself, habitat enhancement could be carried out to extend the areas of wet woodland, including the creation of areas of standing water, the introduction of gravel beds to achieve riffles, flow regulation, and refuge and spawning grounds within the wetland areas. Whilst the wet woodland area is being enhanced, the potential to secure a new viewing platform could be investigated so that visitors can access this special landscape. Alongside this and other measures to increase the understanding of the area's heritage and wildlife significance will be the restoration of the Kew Meridian.
So those are the 6 key strategic sites. Don't forget that Rewilding Arcadia is also looking at additional ways that the blue-green corridor along the Thames that connects these places can be enhanced. As Rewilding Arcadia is an umbrella project developed by the Thames Landscape Strategy, work on the ground to rewild the 6 sites will be implemented and funded in different ways. The first funding bid being developed is for the Old Deer Park and Kew Ha projects, including the new 5-hectare wetland. This is looking towards a landfill tax credit scheme grant in the autumn, linked to funding from the Heritage Fund. We will also be progressing the Hammond Petersham project further over the summer 2020. At the moment, we are looking at ways to fund the education and outreach element of the project. This is running alongside the first stage of consultation to gather support for the initiative with our partners and community groups in order to fine-tune our ideas. Once this scoping stage is finished, we will publish a final report that sets out the project's future direction, including key milestones and our potential sources of funding. As you may imagine, this has somewhat been disrupted by the current COVID-19 restrictions. This film has been produced to continue our consultation during the lockdown. We know that it does not replace the great work that the TLS team was doing with all of our partners and hundreds of community groups to find out how our partners would like the scheme to progress. But it does summarise the main elements of the project. To conclude, Rewilding Arcadia is an umbrella project to reconnect water, people and wildlife with the natural floodplain of the Arcadian Thames. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation.